Welcome to another episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm your host Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode, we'll be exploring the story of one of the most influential couples in the history of Alnwick Castle and of the Georgian period in England, Hugh and Elizabeth Percy, also known as the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. Married at the beginning of the 1740s, by the end of that decade, Elizabeth had become heiress to the Percy estates. When her father died, Hugh took the Percy family name, and together they inherited Alnwick Castle, as well as two great houses in London, Sion House and Northumberland House. During their lifetimes, the couple restored all these houses, plus their existing home in Yorkshire, Stanwick Hall, and filled them with incredible collections. To learn more about their significance as collectors and their importance in 18th century society, I spoke with Adriano Aymonino from the University of Buckingham, the expert on the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. Please enjoy. I am very happy to be joined on today's episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast by Dr Adriano Aymonino of the University of Buckingham, where he's Senior Lecturer and Director of Undergraduate Programmes of the Department of History and History of Art. His latest book, Enlightened Eclecticism, The Grand Design of the First Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, was released last year. Thank you for joining us, Adriano. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to start with a big question. Who were the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, and what makes them so significant?
That's a big question. Indeed, they were, I would say, at the risk of exaggeration, they were the greatest patrons of art and architecture in England in the second half of the 18th century. Most of their activities, I would say, both in terms of collecting and in terms of patronage, because they both collected works of art that had already been produced by artists and also engaged in active patronage of new artists, new architects, and new scholars. Their activities span the central decades of the Georgian period. So I would say they go from the 1730s to the 1780s. So they provide an ideal lens, an ideal case study through which one can understand basically the production of art and architecture and the relationship between art and architecture. So let's say the aesthetical sphere with politics and society in the age of the Enlightenment, in the age of the expansion of the British Empire, in the age of the Grand Tour. So they are a crucial player in a period of great dynamic changes, of connections between the north of Europe and the south of Europe, etc., etc. What I mean in the sense is that not only their patronage and collecting activities are very long-lasting and huge because they were among the richest peers in England in the 18th century, so the financial means were extremely vast in that sense. But also, what is really fascinating, and the reason why I decided to study the Northumberland, which was the subject of my PhD thesis, is because I understood by visiting the archives at Alnwick that they could provide a wonderful, in a way, multifaceted lens, as I said before, which encapsulate a whole period. They built a Palladian villa. They built a neoclassical villa outside London, Sion House. They built the largest Gothic revival interior of the 18th century, the Alnwick Castle of Payne and Adam, which unfortunately, in my opinion, was destroyed in the 19th century and replaced by what we see today, which is neo-Renaissance in a way. So they alternate classical and Gothic, which coexist at the same time and in the same patron in the middle of the 18th century, something that usually we don't take for granted. And also the Duke and the Duchess could express two completely different tastes. The taste of the Duke was the taste of the Republic of Letters, the taste of the Grand Tour, the taste of travel, and the taste of classical aesthetics. So he collected copies of very famous Renaissance and Baroque paintings. He collected copies of canonical Greek and Roman statues that could be seen in Rome and in Florence. He collected gems, antiquarian publications, prints, all related either to classical antiquity or to Raphael and the classical trends of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque. The Duchess expresses in a completely different taste, which is a taste much more focused on Northern Europe. She traveled on her own, at least from the 1760s, to the Netherlands, the United Provinces, as they were called in the 18th century, the Principates of Germany, France, etc., etc. She never went on her own to Italy. So her taste is really the taste of Northern Europe, of the Middle Ages, of the Gothic. So both of them, in a way, they work together in this huge campaign of patronage and collecting. But what is fascinating is that they really incarnate, they embody two different aesthetics that could coexist at the time, even physically, because at Northumberland House, which was the huge palace on the Strand, destroyed in 1874. Basically, it was right in front of where the National Gallery is today, and it was destroyed in order to connect Trafalgar Square with the newly built embankment. Today, if you go there, there's still Northumberland Avenue. So this huge 16th and 17th century house that they rebuilt, so they're in a way stronghold in the middle of London, displayed the collection of the Duke, so the classical taste and the old masters and the copies, a ground floor in the stateroom, while the first floor was the realm of the Duchess, where spread over 20 rooms, she displayed and stored her museum. So a museum made of prints, of gems, of coins, of drawings, of natural specimens, of corals, marbles, shells, dried plants, etc., etc., etc. Her is really a cabinet taste. And in fact, all these works of art and all these collectibles were displayed in small spaces, while the taste of the Duke at ground floor was performed in huge staterooms, etc., etc. So this is why, in a way, I think that they are truly important. This is not to say that they are unique, because, of course, that's the 18th century, and especially the central decades of the centuries, are famous to be one of the most active period in terms of collecting a patronage in the history of England and Britain in general. But they were peculiar in terms of scale, in terms of duration, and in terms of juxtaposed aesthetics. Not to mention that they are among the greatest patrons of Robert Adam, of Canaletto, and many others. So this is, in a nutshell, why they should be studied.
And was the Duchess particularly significant as a female collector at the time? Was that a common thing, or was it a male-dominated sphere in the Georgian era?
I would say that the field was still male-dominated, indeed. The great collections of the 18th century are mostly, whether aristocratic or, let's call it, middle class, as Daniel Defoe called this new budding bourgeoisie, so the merchants, the doctors, the diplomats, etc., etc., the middling sort. So whether aristocratic or middle class, these collections were mostly arranged by men. Inevitably, it was still, in a way, a patriarchal society. However, the 18th century is the first century when you have several female collectors, not only in England, also in France, in Italy, in Germany. It's a century that really actually opens up in terms of gender division. And in a way, it's even, in my opinion, it's even more allowed for rich women, of course, for women belonging to the upper echelons of society, allowed a level of freedom that not even in the following century, in Victorian time, we see. So the 18th century is a century where the gender divisions are in a way more fluid. In fact, the Duchess of Northumberland certainly constitutes a peculiar example because her collection was truly vast and situated right in the middle of London. But you have many others. I don't want to mention all of them, just one, the Duchess of Portland. Mary Cavendish, the Duchess of Portland, who assembled the largest collection of natural specimens, not only in England, but probably in Europe at that time, helped by Daniel Solander, the famous naturalist who sailed on Captain Cook's first voyage, together with Thomas Banks, etc., etc. So a young dynamic, rich aristocratic lady with natural interests who also collected the famous Portland vase today at the British Museum. Managed to put together at Bulstrode, mostly, so outside London, in a country house, one of the largest collections of Europe in that sense. I would say that in terms of understanding female collecting and patronage in the 18th century, it is crucial to investigate the world of the court, because most of these women were related or held position in the court of George II, George III. The Duchess of Northumberland was lady of the bedchamber of Queen Caroline. The Duchess of Portland and others had important position at court. Queen Charlotte was an active patron of female scholarship and female intellectual endeavors. She had a huge library. She collected prints. All this has been published in recent exhibitions, etc., etc. But indeed, she is part of a galaxy of very powerful women who managed to leave a sign in terms not only of collecting and patronage, but in terms of taste making. Because the history of collecting and patronage is relevant only if can shed light on how taste is produced. What are the theoretical and practical guidelines that determine the spread of a certain style, of a certain aesthetical preference? Otherwise, it's a bit sterile as a discipline.
One of the crucial things about the Duchess of Northumberland, particularly when it comes to Alnwick Castle at least, was she was a member of the Percy family. She had Percy ancestry. Did this play into her restorations, the couple's patronage at all? How did they celebrate the Percy history?
Indeed, I would say that actually that's the very reason why they embarked on such a huge campaign of patronage, because you have to remember that actually when she married Hugh Smithson, later the first Duke of Northumberland, and they got married in 1740, he was just a baronet from Yorkshire with modest ancestors. And in fact, the marriage was fiercely opposed by the grandfather of the Duchess, so the proud sixth Duke of Somerset, who probably was absolutely an unbearable character, one of the most, powerful figures in early 18th century politics and society. He opposed this marriage with all his means, actually. However, when eventually her brother, Lord Beauchamp, died in the 1740s, she inherited titles and lands and houses, so that in 1750, all of a sudden, when her father died, the seventh Duke of Somerset, they, the couple, changed their name into Percy. He took his seat in the House of Lords, etc., etc. So they inherited title and possessions. Of course, as you can imagine, she was the real heiress of blood and land. And so in all their activities, the obsession with ancestry, with heraldry, with medieval pageantry, with rituals and symbols coming from the age of the Crusades and the age of Hotspur and the glorious medieval times of castles, of Alnwick, were displayed with almost an obsession, I would say. So that, in a way, patronage and collecting in all its form was used in order to reaffirm the name of the Percy within the English aristocracy. The name had disappeared in the late 17th century, was revived through her, through the female line. So, in a way, patronage and collecting were used to reaffirm the name of the Percy within the aristocracy and also to show that they were at the forefront of national taste, in a way. Probably because they always felt that they had to compensate for the humble origins of Hugh Smithson, of the Duke. And in fact, if you read the contemporary sources from Horace Walpole to correspondence written in the 1750s, the old aristocracy sneered them as, in a way, nouveau riche. But through their patronage and collecting activities and the physical building of houses and interiors, they demonstrated that the Percy heritage was still very alive within the English aristocracy and within the culture and society of Georgian England. So I would say that if again, you have to take into consideration the fact that the taste was split, was not in opposition, was, I would say, they represented two faces of the same coin. While Sion House, which is the great neoclassical villa just outside London, still there, built, refurbished by Robert Adam in the 1760s, is really the playing ground, I would say, of the Duke, where references to the classical past, especially the Roman past, are displayed in a very sumptuous way. Alnwick Castle was the playground of the Duchess, in a sense that she decided to refurbish it in Gothic revival taste. She decided to display a huge array of heraldic shields and heraldic trees all over the building, armors and weapons and portraits of the ancestors, etc., etc. So she tries to recreate in a way, the medieval appearance of the castle. So it's really a phenomenon of, rather than Gothic revival, it's a phenomenon of medieval revival. Proto-Romantic medieval revival. She tries to recreate the spirit and the material nature of the Middle Ages within the walls of Alnwick. Of course, one of her great models in this sense was Horace Walpole, who had refurbished his mock castle, as he called it, Strawberry Hill, outside London and very close to Sion House, had completely refurbished the house in the 40s and the 50s. And the Duchess looked at what Walpole had done there. But whereas Walpole could build only a mock castle where the citation of the medieval past and the medieval lore was displayed in a playful way, in an ironic way, she recreated a real castle. So she had, in a way, a big real castle that could be brought back to the medieval times. Not to say that the Gothic revival of Adam is accurate in terms of medieval Gothic. It's completely over the top and very 18th century. But nonetheless, the fact that, for instance, there were no paintings on display apart from portraiture, etc., revealed the fact that actually there's a consistent attempt at creating a whole interior, not just from an architectural point of view.
But as you mentioned earlier, the interiors that they created at Alnwick Castle in the 18th century can no longer be seen. The 19th century restorations 100 years later got rid of those. But is there anything of the impact they made on Alnwick Castle that you can still see there today, or are the first Duke and Duchess mostly concentrated at Sion House today?
Well, I would say that one of the most difficult things, one of the greatest challenges in writing the book was the fact that most of their collections were dispersed in the late 19th century. With the demolition of Northumberland House, most of the collection were redistributed in other houses, altering the 18th century logic of display, and then many objects were sold at auction throughout the 20th century. So it was a long research in terms of provenance, in terms of location, in order to understand what was part of their collection in the 18th century. So I would say that at Alnwick, whether at Sion you can still see more or less the interiors as they were in the 18th century, apart from the drawing room where most of the paintings there come from Northumberland House. But in general, I would say that the general feeling, the general aspect of Sion is still pretty much the same that you would have seen in the 1760s and 70s. Alnwick has been altered beyond recognition in the sense that, yes, you can still see some of their intervention in the external walls. I would say that the main gate that actually brings you to the inner court of Alnwick is still as they left it in the 18th century, mostly medieval. So that's an original piece of medieval architecture, but it was preserved also by Anthony Salvin and the architects who worked on the castle in the 19th century. So these architects, under the patronage of the fourth Duke, they refurbished the castle completely. So it looks much more, in a way, Victorian than it would have looked like in the 18th century. And the reason behind this is that by the middle of the 19th century, I would say even by the beginning of the 19th century, that very delicate, almost rococo use of architectural details that Adam was so good at arranging had gone out of fashion because it was considered too fragile, too decorative, too whimsical, and instead, in a way, the principles of Victorian architecture took over. And so Alnwick Castle is an attempt at reconstructing, in the middle of the 19th century, a more philologically accurate medieval castle. Inside, that was the period of Renaissance revival. So everything you see there today is the result of the 19th century restoration. Having said so, a lot of chimney pieces, very often chimney pieces were retained. Whenever an interior was completely transformed, chimney pieces were retained because they were incredibly expensive, made of stone rather than bricks. And so chimney pieces from the original castle are still seen in some of the rooms, many private rooms at Alnwick. Some of the paintings, wonderful paintings, that extraordinary painting by Canaletto, the view of the Thames and St. Paul seen through the arch of Westminster Bridge, still under construction, which in my opinion is one of the most powerful images of the 18th century, and certainly the most beautiful image that Canaletto ever produced during his stay in London. The Canalettos and many other paintings come from Northumberland House. However, many other paintings came in the 19th century with the Camuccini collection. The fourth Duke bought a famous collection arranged in Rome by the Camuccini family, so a family of painters, etc., etc. So it's a mixture. And really, you need to reconstruct backwards the history of the collections and the objects and how they fit within interiors in order to understand their real and true importance. Just to give you an example, the beautiful view by Canaletto, there are two at Alnwick. One is a view in perspective of the bridge, and the other is this magnificent view of the arch of the bridge under construction. They were commissioned by Hugh Smithson in the 1740s because he was one of the great supporters of the building of Westminster Bridge. He was part of all the committees that gathered together in order to build and finish the bridge. So by commissioning Canaletto that painting and by having a print, this is crucial, having a print engraved after the Canaletto painting that clearly states in its caption that that painting was in the collection of Hugh Smithson, you kill many birds with one stone, as it were. So you promote yourself as one of the great promoter of new functional infrastructure in the London of the Enlightenment, and you promote yourself as one of the great patrons of the most fashionable Italian landscape painter in London. So all these strategies of spreading patronage and taste through prints and publication were absolutely common in the middle of the 18th century. But if you do not realize the role that a painting like that could play within a policy of self-promotion in that period, the painting loses, in a way, much of its meaning, despite the fact that actually you can also enjoy it purely from an aesthetical point of view.
And the promotion on the part of the Duke sort of continued even after the Duchess died in 1776, because at Westminster Abbey, and you can still see this today as well, there is a monument to the Duchess of Northumberland and the Percy family. What can you tell us about the funeral monument of the Duchess?
That's again is a very peculiar funeral monument, and is very Northumberland in typical Northumberland taste, in the sense that actually by that date the funerary monument was built, if my memory serves me right, between 1776 and 1782, something like that. So immediately in the years following the death of the Duchess in 1776. By that date, most of the chapels in the royal part of the abbey, so the shrine, the chapels around the shrines, had been completely filled by Tudor, Jacobean, Carolinian monuments. So it was already extremely packed in that sense. The Northumberland managed to get a place thanks to their family relationship with the Dukes of Somerset, and the Duke and Robert Adam, because the funerary monument is based on a drawing by Robert Adam, still today preserved at the Sir John Soane Museum, where most of the drawings by Robert Adam are kept. They devise a funerary monument that it's a sort of strange hybrid. It's a monster for the late 18th century in the sense that it's classical in its details. If you look at the single details, you have, Doric triglyphs and metope, you have a pyramid, etc., etc. But in the overall shape of the monument, it tries to mimic the Tudor and Jacobean monuments that surrounded it and still do today in the St. Nicholas Chapel, which is the last chapel to the right before you enter the Mary Chapel. Again, you see the obsession with decorum, so propriety, with heritage, with history. It's absolutely crucial. They don't want to build, a huge, new, fashionable, gaudy neoclassical monument there, because the press and Westminster Abbey is really can be considered as a sculpture museum for the 18th century. So all the great sculpture of the 18th century, from Ruysbroeck to Roubilliac and Robert Adam, built funerary monument at Westminster Abbey, and was one of the very few places where you can see sculpture, modern sculpture, on public display. So the press, of course, whenever a new monument was unveiled, the press went crazy and substantially either praised the effort of the designer and the sculpture or criticized it bitterly. Very often, criticism was more widespread than praise, I would say. So there's a lot of pressure there, and the Northumberland want to, yes, impose a new monument in an area of the abbey which was very symbolic, but they want to give a general shape to the monument that actually is in line with the traditional monuments that are there. And also the funerary monument displays the traditional allegories of faith, charity, and hope, virtues of a Christian citizen. And the figure of charity is the Duchess herself, who was famous for her charitable activity. But that's more, typical run-of-the-mill symbolism for funerary monument of the individual who didn't have a specific public role or cultural role. So very often Christian symbolism was used in order to, in a way, celebrate the deceased without boasting too much. So it's perfectly in tune with the rest of the commissions of the Northumberland, where you have Gothic, you have Jacobean, you have classical, you have Palladian, you have neoclassicism, all mixed together in one funerary monument in this case.
It is very, very impressive when you see it, just as any of the items and collections that we have at Alnwick today, they're still just as impressive 200 and 300 years later. I've got one more question. Away from the patronage and the collecting, was the Duke and Duchess's marriage a happy one? Were they completely independent, living separate lives, or were they together as a couple, even if their tastes were different?
I will answer this question in a second, but also what I would stress is also it would be absolutely, you are perfectly right. At Alnwick, which I forgot to say before, in the archives, you still have wonderful objects that were in the collection of the Duchess: gems, intaglios, marble specimens,
historical curiosities,
which are absolutely wonderful, from the gloves that allegedly were worn by Elizabeth I on the day of coronation to the nightcap of Cromwell. That category of historical curiosities fits in very well with the obsession with Northern history, ancestry, and royalty of the Duchess, and they're still there. In terms of their private life, yes, indeed, unlike many aristocratic couples of the 18th century, they were a happy couple. They were a happy couple throughout their lives. They truly loved each other. The previous archivist at Alnwick, Colin Trimpton, even put together a series of letters that were found in the sarcophagus, in the memorial, because the Duchess is, of course, buried at Westminster Abbey, but in the memorial that was built in the chapel at Alnwick by Robert Adam. And there are love letters that clearly the Duke placed there when the Duchess died. And if you read their letters and correspondence, I have to say that the archival material that the couple left is daunting. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. We have 56 diaries that were kept by the Duchess. She used to write obsessively every day. 56 diaries that she kept from the 1750s to 1776. A chronicle of also her travel to Europe. So you have wonderful passages on the opera houses of Paris and Brussels, on the great collections of the continent, on the coronation of the Dauphin of France, Louis XVI with Marie Antoinette, etc., etc., etc. They are wonderful source for historians of all paths. And within this enormous amount of written sources, you have innumerable love letters between the two. This is not to say, which was typical in the 18th century, that they didn't have lovers. As I said, also in this case, the 18th century probably is a bit more liberal than the 19th century. Victorian morality was far away in that sense. And he had mistresses. He had 3 illegitimate children. So 2 girls and a boy. The girls, actually, he managed to keep a relationship with. The boy, because, of course, as you can imagine, a boy poses a threat to the inheritance line. So he was never recognized by the Duke. He grew up in a way far away from the Northumberland. He became immensely rich. He kept the name Smithson, and then he donated all his money to a new institution in the United States of America, the so-called Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian is there thanks to, in a way, the bequest of Hugh Smithson, illegitimate child. And probably they should thank the fact that actually he probably bore grudge against his father and donated everything to the United States of America. According to contemporary sources, also the Duchess had lovers, especially when she traveled on her own in the continent. So, in a way, an ante litteram open couple, but very happy indeed, and they loved each other until the end.
So they made a great pairing, and they left quite the impressive legacy. And a lot of that is detailed, catalogued and collected in your book, Enlightened Eclecticism. It's a beautiful book. It's incredibly well researched. And if it sounds like you'd be interested in that, Adriano is giving a talk at Alnwick Castle on the 7th of April this year, and you can get tickets for that now from the Alnwick Castle website. For now, though, Adriano, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Enlightened Eclecticism is available now from Yale Books and from the Alnwick Castle shop, and tickets to hear Adriano speak at Alnwick Castle this April are now on sale from our website alnwickcastle.com. If you'd like to hear more about anything we've spoken about in this episode of the podcast, please get in touch and let us know on Twitter at Alnwick Castle or by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, or any of the episodes we've done so far, please subscribe, share it with your friends, and leave us a review or rating. On the next episode of the podcast, I'll be talking to the author John Goodall about not just Alnwick Castle, but the history of castles themselves. Until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.